right, present. And here we go. All right, well, thanks for coming, everybody. This is going to be uh, a question writing seminar for the year. I put 2021 on there. Maybe this will become an annual thing. But thanks for coming. And we're kind of going to drink a little bit through the fire hose today. Everybody here has a background in quizzing and question writing to some degree. So I think bear with me. We will go through a lot of stuff very quickly, but a lot of it is familiar and we have a good knowledge base to go with. Heather is also here. Heather and I have worked on this project together. I am presenting and she will be speaking and interrupting as needed to correct all my many errors. Um, but yeah, so welcome to the question writing seminar. And I think the first thing to address is like, why do this? Why do a question writing seminar? Because we haven't done one in the past. There was no question writing seminar 2020. Why now? And I think something that Heather and I have noticed over the past few years at internationals is uh, a lot of opinions on what makes a question set good, what makes questions good or bad. Uh, in addition, we've got an ever-changing rulebook. There have been a number of changes in recent years, and as the rulebook changes, if people don't stay up to date on it, there can be misconceptions that creep in, which is the case for some new rules. Uh, Another bullet point, something we've noticed, is a preponderance of district traditions, we might say, uh, to evoke Fiddler on the Roof a little bit, right? There are traditions that kind of develop within districts, which are great. Sometimes, though, they go against what the official rulebook says, or sometimes it might be a perfectly good thing, a particular question writing style, say, but maybe it's just particular to that district and no other district writes questions that way or has that particular interpretation of a rule. And so that's great, but we want to incorporate all of that and be faithful to the international's rule book and write the best possible question set for that. And kind of finally here, finding a large enough pool of question writers and editors each year has proven tough. Heather can testify to that. Sometimes, according to her, it's difficult to find enough people to contribute. And so the motivation for doing the seminar is essentially we wanted to facilitate more communication between districts so that iron can sharpen iron and we can all get better at writing and editing. And also so that hopefully at internationals, people will be a little bit less surprised by the questions they hear, perhaps less negative feedback, which there hasn't been tons of people whining or anything, but there is some constructive criticism here and there. We want people to show up at internationals and feel like the questions make sense with what they're comfortable with. Every district, not just the districts that contribute the most to the set. And finally, we just want a more organized method for getting writers and editors each year. So we're trying to, I guess, increase the amount of communication throughout the year about question writing and editing so that we can get that. So what will we learn today? What's going on? Today's focus is going to be on writing a valid, good question set, including many valid and good questions. What we are not talking about today is stuff like tools to use for question writing and editing. That's a whole separate topic. If you have a very slow method of writing questions and would like to improve it, that'll be a little bit outside the purview of today's discussion. Griffin's an expert on that, and he is here in this meeting. So you can chat with him. I will briefly mention the application he wrote to write questions with later on, but it's not the focus today. But we will talk about a lot of validity stuff and a lot of what makes a question good, not just what makes it valid and legal to ask. We will talk about internationals a lot. That's going to be some of the focus because we're trying to boost up a set of super competent writers and editors. But all the concepts do transfer to the district. So even if you don't want to write for internationals, everything today is useful for you. And lastly, we're going to be distinguishing between three different categories. And maybe I should have reversed these. So number 3 says rulebook on this PowerPoint, but I'm going to swap it to number 1. So first of all, there's rulebook. There's stuff that is objective and factual in the rule book, such as you can't start or finish the verse that has the same 5 words as the start of another verse. That's objective. You can't write that question, it's invalid. And then you have best practices, which are, a good question should follow this kind of format, and it's pretty well understood that it should follow this kind of format. Uh, as an extreme example, we might say, if we were writing a question on John 1:1, um, a good question would be, in the beginning was whom, right? But someone might write the question, beginning was the what? And I think we could all agree that even though that's technically perhaps a valid question, it's not best practices. You could say it's tricky or misleading and invalidate it that way. But the point being that this is less objective, but it's still like pretty well agreed upon by most people that this is the best way to do it. And then lastly, there's opinions, which is just Jeremy being nitpicky about things that he could be wrong about. And I will mention a few of those today. And I will try to mention them as opinions when they come up and make a distinction between what I'm just throwing out there and what are things that are more objective and kind of what's in the middle. Because part of the whole idea of this is to facilitate communication. So if I'm wrong about something and I'm writing a bunch of weird questions that everybody on the East Coast thinks are wonky and they show up in the internationals question set, that's not good. you know, uh, or maybe the East Coast could include those questions in their set. Maybe they're good questions. I don't know. One way or another, we want to facilitate that discussion. So we're going to talk about each individual question type, but first, just some ideas about general question writing philosophy. What are we trying to do with a question set? What should it achieve? And the first point I have here is we want to write good questions, not just valid ones. I think everybody can agree to that. A question is valid, but not good. Every one of us has had those discussions. The question set should cover the whole material. There shouldn't be random verses missing in an ideal question set, particularly for higher levels of competition. We want to make sure that every single verse and really all the content of each verse is covered by, and here's this next bullet point, by whichever question types suit that material the best. And we'll talk a little bit about that with each individual question type. Sometimes a question might be valid, but not the best way to ask a portion of scripture. And lastly, we want to facilitate easy quiz mastering. Keep using the word facilitate. There's a lot of facilitating we're doing, I guess. We want to make sure that our question set is easy for quiz masters to use in the heat of the moment when they're trying to focus on many other things. So to that end, for example, would be something like when you write the answer text to a question, making sure it only includes the things that need to be said as part of the answer. And not just copy pasting, say, the whole verse, which I've seen people do before. If you have only that part of the text which is necessary for the answer, that makes it way easier on the quizmaster in the moment to rule correctly or incorrectly on a question. So that's kind of what I mean by that. And there's other things that apply to that category as well, but that's just an example. And here's a big picture sort of general philosophy thing. First, I have this point that you want to think like a question writer, not a quizzer, which sounds weird at first. Stick with me. We'll I don't know. I think you'll agree if you listen to this whole section. But we want to write a question set which best represents the material that's in front of us, not a question set that is skewed to be too easy. This is a common opinion I hear, and I think it is a bit of a misconception. There's I guess the opinion that if we write a question set that has tough questions or questions that aren't unique in the first couple syllables, then quizzers are going to err on them, and that's bad. Errors are not bad. Errors are part of the journey. Quizzers prepare to get errors. And I want to shift our focus if anyone is thinking that we want to avoid errors by any means possible. Think about the quizzer who's prepared really hard on a finish the verse list. That quizzer has made a list of every single verse start in the whole material. They've figured out which ones are likely to be asked, and they're preparing for the fact that they're eventually going to jump on a therefore finish the verse. The most prepared quizzers will have in their mind, what am I going to say if I jump on a therefore? What if I get a little bit of the third syllable? and then maybe I can pick it out. What if it's a finish these two verses, and there might be certain verses which are better to guess as therefores on a finish these two verses as opposed to a finish the verse. And some people don't want to write any therefore finish the verses, but the problem with that is you're actually skewing the competition away from what the most prepared quizzers have prepared for. They're expecting those questions to come in there, and they're preparing their jump speed and their mastery of the material accordingly. Likewise, we might think of W questions, those infamous what's and who's on interrogatives. And there is a tendency for some people to think we should not write that many of those because they often get erred on. Well, the best interrogative quizzers are watching for W's, adjusting their jump accordingly, and even many of them have studied lists of such questions. Um, and so we want to reward quizzers who are looking at the material and thinking through what are the various ways this material could be asked in the Bible quizzing question format. How can I best prepare to answer those questions? And knowing that I'm going to get errors because there's many errors at internationals. If we don't do that, we can end up with a question set that is unique immediately, and the quizzers eventually will pick up on that and begin doing Hail Mary jumps all over the place. And I've seen this happen at quiz meets, just 1.5 syllable interrogative jumps, and they're getting 70% of them right. And we want to avoid that. We want to avoid skewing toward, I guess, too much Hail Mary jumping. That's the best term I can think of for it. So errors are part of the journey. Think like a question writer. Don't always be thinking in your mind, how quickly does this become unique? If it's a good question that tests the material well, you should write it. However, there's another side of this, which is think like a quizzer, not a question writer. Here's the other side of the coin. And I think when it comes to this, what level of skill are we writing these questions for? And how is that level of competition best served? So if you're writing questions in the district level, depends on how strong your district is. But you might not want to have that many finish these two verses. That's going to be tough for the rookies to do. You might only want to include pronoun clarifications if they're obvious. You know, he is Jesus or Paul or something like that, right? Stuff that makes you go back 3 verses to find the clarification might be discouraging for quizzers at this level because they maybe only memorized that one verse that you asked the question on. And they jumped on it, they thought they knew it, and now because of a he clarification, they're wrong. And that's discouraging. So you might want to think about that at the district level. With situation questions, you might only want to have one verse. You might want to have short answers, not do super long whens and wheres from 5 verses ago, right? But at internationals, the whole point is that we're challenging them, we're testing them, right? Every quizzer at internationals should know every verse. I mean, and it's pretty close to that. There might be a few quizzers here and there, but for the most part, quizzers can quote the material at internationals. So don't be shy about finish these 2 verses. Don't be shy about pronoun clarifications, which are 5 verses away. Situation questions, according to the rules, can get very difficult, and they should get very difficult at internationals. We want to test them. And we shouldn't be afraid of making questions that we think some quizzers won't get, especially at the internationals level. We want the quizzers who know the material the best to be able to distinguish themselves with their ability to answer these more difficult questions. So you want to think like a question writer and you want to think like a quizzer, both at the same time and in different ways. But without biasing too much toward making the question set easy, particularly at the internationals level. So now let's jump into, I guess before I move into the question types in particular, does anyone have any questions? You can unmute yourself, and I'm shooting a bunch of stuff at you, so we'll stop it on occasion for questions. But so we'll move on then to the most basic question type, the interrogative. Most of the things we're going to say in this section apply to other question types, multiple answers and references. And I'm not going to cover stuff that is obvious to people who have been in quizzing for a while. So there's plenty about validity I'm not going to say. But I'm going to cover a few things that are either new or not as well understood. So the first thing to understand about validity that a lot of people don't know is that in the first 5 words, you have to have a completed unique word or phrase. And the misconception that a lot of people have here is that unique phrases are limited to only 3 words. So some people think as long as the whole string of 5 words is unique, compared to the rest of the material, then it's a valid interrogative. That's not true. It actually has to be one of the 3 strings of 3 words that is contained in those first 5 words. It's a bit of a convoluted rule. If you ask me, I think it should be changed, but right now, that's the rule. So if you're searching validity and you don't see an obvious unique word in the first 5 words, what you will need to do is search words 1, 2, and 3. Do those appear anywhere in the material? Words 2, 3, and 4. Do those appear anywhere in the material? And then 3, 4, and 5. So something to keep in mind. Also, if the interrogative word is the first word, so what or a who or what have you, then that's included in the first 5 words. So it would have to be unique out of words 2, 3, 4 or 3, 4, 5. So that makes it a little bit trickier to look for validity if there's no unique word, but an important thing to clarify. And lastly, this is a newer rule in the last few years, but negative answers to questions are invalid. This means that if the verse says he is not good, you can't ask the question he is what, because the answer would be not good. That's a negative answer to the question. You could write he is not what, and the answer would be good, and then that's valid. Now that is tricky to implement in practice. There are a lot of places where it's like, is that a negative answer or not? Other words that can be used are things like neither and nor. Those are negatives. I've found that there are occasional instances where I don't actually know how to rule on this rule. But it's good to keep in mind, if it's something obvious like he is not good, then a good captain at internationals is going to challenge you on that for sure. So you definitely don't want to include those in your set. And when we get to MAs, that also, it's especially tricky with MAs. So we'll get there when we get there, though. So that's some stuff about validity. Let's talk a little bit about the interrogative words you can use. First of all, we have what. In quizzing, what is used in all sorts of ways that don't make sense in English grammar, of course. It's kind of a catch-all word in quizzing. Don't get too fancy with it, but there are definitely times when a good interrogative question sounds a little, wonky in English because of the what. So, like we don't have how many, for example, as a permissible interrogative. So you might encounter a scenario where what refers to a number, whereas we might not normally speak that way. Who, whom, and whose. So the rulebook says you can use who or a form of it. And those forms would be whom and whose. You use whom at the end of a sentence, so, or to whom did this happen, but who if it's at the beginning. And then you've got whose if it's a possessive apostrophe s. I can't think of the way to say it, explain it, but you know what I mean. If it says God's kingdom, whose kingdom is the question you're looking for. So here's an interesting conundrum that sometimes comes up with this is a descriptor of a person. So it's talking about a person, but it's a descriptor like a vocation, such as the builder, mentioned in Hebrews 3. Is the builder a what or a who? And I've heard it done both ways. I tend to do who for this. If it's anything pertaining to a person, who may be glad together, the sower and the reaper. So that's how I do it. I think this is one of those opinion things. I prefer it that way. I think it's clearer.
I agree with you, Jeremy, on that. A builder, if it's the builder, it's definitely a who. The instances where you might use a what as the catch-all would be in cases where it's like both the builder and the house, and that's the answer, and it's a multiple answer. So then you're going to use what, because you can't call a house a who.
Amen to
So
that. Yep.
yeah, that's where I would land. But that's an instance where what is a thing we use in quizzing that doesn't make any sense in English.
True. Yep, I agree entirely. And MAs, that is an issue with MAs. So we'll be covering that too. So yeah, so I would go with who on that personally. How about when? On the one hand, when seems simple enough. At that time, 6 days later, when Jesus had finished saying these things, all great whens. And something to keep in mind with especially interrogatives like when, where, why, and how, often you can find great questions that will go back in the verse. So it'll be, when Jesus crossed into Capernaum, he cast out many demons. He cast out many demons when, right? Then you got to go back. Those questions are tricky for rookies in the district. So that's something to keep in mind with your question writing. But at internationals, have at it. Run, Forrest, run. We want all of those in there.
Oh, I
For
actually
sure.
think that you should absolutely write them for district level because it's a great learning tool. Like if that isn't the first thing that you learn as an interrogative quizzer, that like go back to the beginning of the verse and quote it. I don't know what is. So I 100% think that you should write those in every level because they're great. And if it's, especially if it's a unique, like a key verse, they know the verse, they'll learn to go back to the beginning. It's good. It's a good learning tool.
100%. I certainly wouldn't want to come across like prohibit them at the district level. I just tend to get a little more fancy and consistent with those, especially if the answer is back a couple verses with international level question writing. But there's only so many differences between the two. It's the same rule book at the end of the day. I would certainly write some of them at the district level. Uh, but then there's this tricky if clauses, and there's disagreement on this one. So if the phrase is, if you are sons of God, then you are heirs of the kingdom, right? You are heirs of the kingdom when? If you are sons of God. Some people really don't like these. I tend to write them, and I think a lot of the reference materials that you can purchase from what is it, Acme or whatever that book provider, they will mark the phrase as a temporal clause. So this is one of those things that I'm open to being my mind changed on. I don't want quizzers to be confused by it, is the only thing. But it does logically make sense when, under this condition, then, that's the answer to the question. But this is another one of those things where it could depend on the level of quizzing, however you want to figure that out in your own circumstance. If you find quizzers are confused by it, then I would like to know that feedback.
If you do though, just as like from a perspective of collecting the question set and processing it, whether or not you like these, if you decide you don't like to do that, then fine, nobody's making you write them, but definitely don't use an if, don't use any other interrogative for if, because that is the common practice in our that's usually, if it's going to be asked, that's how it's asked. So I don't know what other interrogative you would use. So you either don't write them or you use when.
I could see someone doing a how, and I would throw it out if I was a quizmaster. And I have a very high bar for throwing out questions that I've already asked as a quizmaster, but I would throw it out if it was anything other than a when. Then we've got where, why, how. Not much to say about these. There's not a ton of controversy, I don't think. Again, consider going back in the verse. Those are great. Consider answers that are perhaps not immediately next to the verse, but are still very true to the material. Definitely consider different ways of asking questions. We want the God so loved the world that what questions, but we also want questions that ask things a little differently and penetrate to different aspects of the material. We want to test the quizzers on everything. Then the last one is this bizarre little interrogative which is allowed in the rule book. And I find that it is often used poorly. And it is used in a way that I think most people would write as a what question. People will just throw a which in there. And it'll be like a couple writers in a set, and it'll end up in a question set that's kind of inconsistent. And so this is another one of those opinion things, but in my opinion, a lot of these whiches are technically grammatically reasonable, but you should use what unless you have to use which for some reason. Like which is the only one that makes sense. And which is kind of this interrogative word that designates a subset of a larger set. That's the way I like to think about it. So my token question for which was when we were doing the ESV. In Acts 20, there's a verse that lists a bunch of people that like Paul took with him, and then it ends with and the Asians, Tychicus and Trophimus. And Asians is a unique word. Now, there's no way to ask who those Asians are with any other interrogative that makes sense. You can't do who Asians. You can't do, I mean, you could do the Asians whom, but that's terrible. There's no other way to do it, but you can ask which Asians, and it's a fantastic multiple answer. That no longer exists because now we do the NIV, but that's that's my example. So you've got, out of the whole subset of Asians, these two, Tychicus and Trophimus, are what you're asking. Other good examples I've seen of which is if there's a list of examples of something. So like in Romans 1, you have God's invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature. You could do which invisible attributes. I think that's a little better than what. And because in the text it's specifying this subset, right? So I would say use that judiciously but sparingly. It's going to trip up quizzers when they see it in a quiz, because it doesn't come up very often. But if they know the material, they should be able to work their way through it. And indeed, when I asked the which Asians question at one of the district meets, I still remember the quizzer who jumped, and their reaction to it was awesome. They were like, wait, what? And then they knew the verse, and they're like, oh, it's Tychicus and Trophimus. And that's what I wanted to see out of that question. So yeah, there's the odd one out, that which interrogative.
It looks like we have Jeremy, sorry, I don't mean to interrupt. It looks like we've got a hand up from Ethan.
A hand. Oh, okay.
Yes, I had just one question. Is that okay?
Yeah, go for it, Ethan.
Okay, thank you. So when it came to the difference between what and which, I got the impression that it's kind of a preference, although what is preferable more. How challengeable would it be if there was an oddly phrased question, it was a which?
That's a good question. So this going into the realm more of answer judging and quiz mastering. Like I said, I have a very high bar. If a question is definitively invalid and I get it challenged, I will throw it out. No questions asked, of course. If a question is just bad, I don't feel right about throwing it out. Then it's kind of like I'm deciding after having already asked it that I don't like it. And then I'm being biased by whether or not the quizzer got it right, And if I'm in a good mood and got sleep and I just had lunch, then I'm going to be like, oh, they got it wrong, I'm going to throw it out. Or if I'm grumpy because I didn't get any sleep and the food was terrible or whatever, then I'm going to be like, I want them to error, and then I'm going to be biased toward not throwing it out. And so I'm only going to throw it out if it's definitively invalid. Now, if it's before I ask the question, I'm still going to be really biased towards keeping it in because I don't want to be making those decisions as a quiz master. So with a lot of these which questions, if it's weird, but it's like still sensible grammatically, I'm not going to throw it out, which is why it's so important that our question writing is good.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I see Kristen also has her hand up.
Yeah, with the what and which, the other time that I've found I use which is if there's a word that can be a verb or a noun. So for example, if there was a phrase that it was lustful looks, and I wanted to ask what looks. If I write it as what looks, then people are thinking, well, a person looks, something is doing the looking. But if I write which looks, then that signals that it's talking about a thing instead of a person. Mm-hmm. So again, personal preference, but that is where I find it's less confusing.
That's an excellent observation. I hadn't even considered that. So if it could be ambiguous with a what, certainly, yeah, that's a great point, Kristen. Yeah, and I would probably write it as what looks without thinking about it. See, this is why I did this. This is why we're doing this. I want to hear this stuff.
I actually was thinking about a reference question. I'm not great at references myself, so I don't know where this is, but presumably in a gospel, because the reference question is which Jesus, and in that case, I feel like it needs to be a which as well, because if you say what Jesus, the beginning of the question sounds like what Jesus was doing at the time. Like there's some level of confusion there. So I think that's another instance where you need the which in order to clarify that you really are looking for the descriptor of that.
Or it sounds like you're mad at Jesus. You're like, what, Jesus? Like
that
like
too. What, Jesus?
What,
yeah.
Jesus? Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the apostles had some of those moments, right? Or the 12, I should say. Yeah, so that's also a good point. I think you're probably referring, if I could guess, to the if you receive a different Jesus from the one you received in Corinthians.
Or Jesus Barabbas, I think is what I'm thinking of.
Jesus Barabbas. Yeah.
Yeah.
So which Jesus? I've seen which John in certain materials. I can't remember. It's certainly one of those Gospels or Acts. But yeah, so that's a good one as well. Heather, could you possibly take notes on this? Because I might add those to the bullet points if we do this next year. Okay, thank you. I appreciate it. Okay, so I'm not going to have the participants with their hands raised here. So if you either, Heather, want to notify me when a hand is up, or I'll stop in between each question type for questions, either works. Oh, sorry. Yes, so, okay. So some tips on writing interrogatives. So we're moving from validity to kind of what makes a question good. And so I'm going to do this with each question type. I'm going to separate the two out pretty clearly. With interrogatives, it's important to remember there are literally thousands of good ones. So you don't need to write bad ones. That's the wonderful thing about them. You don't need to write any bad questions, but if an MACR sneaks by that's a little suspect, we might forgive it a little bit. But with interrogatives, there's no reason to ever write bad ones. And something that I notice a lot of newer question writers really struggling with is kind of just doing here's a unique phrase, I'm going to throw an interrogative there and make it a question, and not being very thoughtful about the grammar and meaning of the text. Now, of course, we don't require the quizzers to interpret the text at all. We just want them to spit the words out. But when it comes to question writing, we really want to be asking questions that are asking something meaningful about the text. And that's a really abstract concept and hard to provide examples of. I hope kind of the rest of the presentation hits
I have an
that.
example. I
Go
have an
for it, Heather.
example. So there's a three, rain, often, falling. Rain, often, and falling are all key words. I don't know what material I'm in. Somebody help me out.
You're in Hebrews 6.
Thank you. This is weird because I actually know that material. I don't know what's wrong with my brain, but so asking that as a phrase like rain, often, what, or what, often, falling is very tempting as a question writer because it just looks so juicy because it's sitting there being all bold and cute. But as much as it's a fun phrase and the quizzers will know what it is, it doesn't provide you with a whole lot of useful meaning when it's in a verse that would provide, like if you just made them include more, just broaden the scope, you would have something that is actually like edifying and great to have people repeat in a quiz meet for others to hear.
And to add to that, it looks juicy and you can ask a great question on it. Rain, often, falling on what? I mean, that's not a great question. On land, I don't know. That's at least a better way to ask it. That's what I see a lot of is like unique word and then a what, and it's like often, what, falling. It's like you can do the longer phrase and the interrogative then refers to something meaningful about the text. Actually, now that I'm thinking about it, the rain, often, falling on what is not a great question because it's land that drinks in the rain off. Okay, so that's another issue. But the point being that usually you can find a way to throw that really juicy, lovely, bold, unique word in there and at the start of a question, and it still forms a great question. But because the question is truncated so short, it doesn't have any meaning in it. And at internationals, maybe doesn't matter that much because they know the verse anyways. It really breaks my heart when I see some like key verse getting asked on at district level, and it's just 2 words long and it's super vague, but it's like Romans 3:23 or whatever, all have what? I don't know, whatever it is that someone writes. And it's like, dude, why would you write the question this way when you could write who falls short of the glory of God? I don't know. There's ways people write questions, especially when they're new at it, which are just feel like kind of, I hate to say it, but phoning it in, right? Instead of reading the verse, hey, what interrogatives really are asking something about this, and it can't, there are lots of good questions which are just 2 words, blank what, unique word what, or what, unique word. There's lots of great ones. So it's not that the length of the question is the whole issue. That's what I mean by it's kind of abstract. You got to think about it critically. Okay, so that aside, great example, Heather. Require pronoun clarifications when they add meaning. I think pronoun clarifications are criminally underused in pretty much all question sets I've ever seen. The only time I pretty much ever see them being used is if the answer is just like he or she, like that's the only text in the answer. And then question writers will typically add them. But sometimes there can be a longer phrase, and I'm going to have to make one up now, but it's like, um, I don't know, like maybe the answer is like he went up to Jerusalem and worshiped at the temple, and they don't require the he to be clarified to Jesus. Well, that's adding a ton of meaning to the answer, and we should require the quizzers to say that. This is also one of those things, like I mentioned earlier, where the level of quizzing might matter. So keep that in mind. When it comes to international questions, though, unless it's a throwaway pronoun, I'm writing every clarification, every single one of them. They need to clarify everything. Multiple ones in the same question, even consider possibly, right? And it's not just he, she, and they. There's also it, them, their, that, and which can be pronouns depending on how they're used. So if it says like I don't know, then or there you will find me, there could be clarified to at Jerusalem, right? Uh, so those are all pronouns as well. Please, anything that adds meaning to the answer. The point is the meaning, ultimately. We want them to spit out the words, but that's all clarifications of pronouns are, is spitting out more words. This isn't interpretation. This is a way to get more at the actual text and grammar and the features of the material. So don't include filler conjunctions at the beginning of questions. So this is the but, and for. Those are crucial words, don't get me wrong. Entire libraries have been written about the use of the Greek particle gar, which is translated as for. It's an extremely important word to the flow of thought in like Paul's letters. But don't put them in questions at the beginning of questions, unless you have some weird phrase like, since this happened, blah, 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 blah. Then you can do, since this happened, or, for the love of God, what, do all things. Some sort of phrasing like that. Obviously, that's a different use of the conjunction than in the question. But if it's just, one of those frequent times when it's just at the beginning of a verse, don't include it. It's tempting because it's capitalized, but don't do it. And
It's often it's used. I think Jeremy's battery's low, and that's why he's standing up. So I'm going to talk instead. It often gets used in. I see this in the question set a lot. It's because it makes it unique earlier. So if you tack the for onto the beginning, then the for, and then whatever word comes next, that happens to be a key phrase. So it's tempting to go, okay, well, then the jump mark goes earlier, and then the quizzer can answer it better. And like Jeremy said, that's not the goal of question writing, to make it key as unique as early as possible. It's really not, that's not the point of it. And so often, if it's more meaningful to leave it off, we should leave it off. Sometimes we would leave it on for some of the reasons Jeremy gave, but most of the time, especially if it's just to make it key earlier, that's not sufficient. Ethan has his hand up. Ethan, why don't you go ahead and unmute yourself and ask a question?
Okay, thank you. So basically, if there was a question, if there was a question such as, but the fruit of the Spirit is, and it lists the different things, you would say the fruit of the Spirit is what, instead of but the fruit of the Spirit is what? Okay.
You get it.
Okay. And gotcha. Thank you.
Yeah. Now, and you might actually, I think in that material, you do run into the problem of the fact that the fruit of is not a unique phrase. I don't know if of the Spirit is. There's another verse that says like the fruit of the light, I think. And then, so some people will be tempted to write it as but the fruit because of that. But that goes into my earlier point about write the best question type for the material. In that case, it should be the fruit of whom, as a reference. Now, you could do, I would make an exception for maybe multiple answers because there's not a ton of them. In that case, maybe do but the fruit of the Spirit is what. But it's like there's so many good interrogatives. I wouldn't force a question that starts with a meaningless conjunction just because it's not as good of a question. I'm not going to be upset about it, but I think it makes a better question set, generally speaking. So, and that's more on the opinion side of things. Okay, and the last bullet point I have here is, I think I already mentioned it, avoid including additional text in the answer. You should consider what is actually required here. If there's a big section in the middle that's not actually part of what needs to be said to be counted right, you should do ellipses or something like that that indicates you're skipping something in the middle of the verse, but it's really not necessary for the answer. Likewise, you should extend the answer to however long you think is necessary. And there are times when a question where an answer could be various different lengths depending on how you want to cut it off. Just pick one and go with it, and then the quizmaster will be the one who has to, decide on the answer. So, or the answer judge will have to decide.
To be clear, that ellipses in terms of actual question writing mechanics, I know that's not really what we're talking about, but the ellipses are good for interrogatives, but for multiple answers, we typically use semicolons to separate the individual multiples if they're not in a string. So we're not doing like awkward ellipses and then putting the thing and then awkward ellipses again and then putting the thing. Kristen has her hand up. Go ahead, Kristen.
Do you want us to include extra text in the answer if the quizzer doesn't necessarily need to say it, but it makes it easier to understand? So the example is in Hebrews 9. It was necessary for the copies of the heavenly things to be purified with these sacrifices. The question is, what was necessary? Do you want us to write that it was necessary for, or do you just say for the copies of the heavenly things?
Excellent question. In that instance, definitely write the it was necessary. And I would say in all instances, the only guiding principle is what makes it easy on the quizmaster. In that case, for me, it would be way easier to have the it was necessary. And I for similarly phrased questions, I've done the same thing, But if it's like, what car, red car, red is the answer, you might want to write red car instead of just red. That's kind of like some people probably prefer it one way, some the other, and that's fine. It just needs to be clear to the quizmaster. That's really the overarching point.
Yeah, we're not unnecessarily copy and pasting the verse. Actually, in the it was necessary piece, I would argue that it is the answer and then the rest is a clarification of it. But
you don't need to write it that way, though.
We don't need to write it that way.
It's continuous material. You're not going back to another section.
Yes.
So what makes it clear is to just write the whole thing. Yeah, I 100% agree that is technically what's going on there. Yeah, so definitely easy quiz mastering is something we can all be a part of as question writers. So, all right, now interrogatives, which ones to write? So you got thousands of good interrogative questions. You're not writing for or buts. You're not writing weird stuff, right? So which ones are you going to write? How are you going to pick them? Because you don't need to waste time writing 6,000 interrogatives. You could write 2,000 and cover the material just fine. So my philosophy, this is just how I do it, is I try to cover at least once all the words, phrases, and sentences which can reasonably be part of an interrogative. So if it's something clearly intended for a reference or multiple answer, here I have the example, he went to Jerusalem with Peter and whom. Don't do that, just write he went to Jerusalem with whom as an MA. I guess you could ask who went to Jerusalem with Peter and John or whatever. That would be a pretty good interrogative. But the point being, as long as it's well suited for an interrogative, I would ask it, cover it at least once. But you don't need to write every permutation of interrogative for every section. So you don't need to write both sides of the same question, for example. You can pick one of who went up to Jerusalem versus Jesus went up where. You could write both of them, and you might want to do that sometimes because you don't want the question set to be too predictable, but you certainly don't need to do it all the time. And that could lead to a question set even that's a little skewed towards particular ways of phrasing and particular grammatical features. You don't necessarily want that. So save yourself time, pick whichever one you think is best, vary it up so it's not all what's and who's, and definitely don't do all not what's and who's, because we want those in the question set as well. Use your best judgment, whichever one you think is better. If the answer is just God, probably do it the other way around, because it's an easily guessable answer. It's okay if we have some of those, but you know, it might be better to start it with God. On the other hand, you don't want every question starting with Jesus. This is just my rambling way of saying, vary it up, pick what you think are better. You don't need to do every possible option. And the same goes with like a long phrase where you could start it at 7 different places within the phrase. Paul does this with like the grace of the glory of the knowledge of the light of the image of God, you know, and you could start it at any one of those places, right? So pick one, you know, pick whichever you think is going to get at the meaning the best. Sometimes you'll have like, he spoke to the prophets who were prophesying long ago, and you could do he spoke to whom. You could do the prophets who were prophesying when, who prophesied long ago. You know, just pick one, whichever you think is best. You don't have to start at every single location of what is essentially the same question. So that's
And
the way
to
you
be
can keep it
clear,
short.
the functional way that this would work out is if the question writer does write every phrase in every possible starting and ending place, because that's a thing too, or you could just decide I'm going to go further with this one and further with this one. It's not, what happens is somebody deletes all of those questions and chooses the best one anyway. So it is to your benefit and to everybody else's benefit to use your judgment up front, because question writers have good judgment and have the ability for good judgment. And if you are feeling like I don't have the ability for this, well, we're going to try to create a solution for you. So that's what I just want to say about that. It's not even just about you don't need to do this, but it's more like that work will literally get deleted. So there's no point in doing that. Kristen has her hand up. Go ahead, Kristen. She took her hand down.
Yeah, sorry. With the example of the prophets who were prophesying when, do we have a internationals level policy about questions with question words in the middle of the phrase? So what you said was absolutely a valid question. I know I have had people tell me I shouldn't write that question because you've got the prophets who were prophesying when. I think it's fine, but I'm wondering what people are saying in other districts.
That's a fine question. If we reduced, like if we made it so that you couldn't have an interrogative word in the middle of a question ever, I think that would be awfully restrictive. So you definitely can say the text as is. And honestly, when a quizmaster reads it, if you have the whole question in front of you, it's very rarely going to sound like that's the end of the question, because they're going to be reading the rest of it. The tone is a relevant piece to consider. Furthermore,
That's the risk of pre-jumping.
Yes.
That's the risk you take. I've never heard that opinion before.
Me neither.
I don't share it. I also don't think that if the question starts with a what or a who that is actually in the text, that's misleading either. There's like in Hebrews, there's who were they who what heard and rebelled. And if you throw that question at someone who doesn't know the material, they'd be like, oh, that's terrible. That sounds bad. Every quizzer who's memorized the verse will get it right. It's a very easy MA if you know the verse, right? So that's one of those, like, is the quizzer going to be confused by this? No. Then we should ask it. I mean,
it can always be thrown out at the district level too. Like if you're quizmastering with rookies, you might throw out a question in advance. You probably are going to have a little bit of a lower bar for when you're going to throw out a question. And as much as we want to facilitate easy quizmastering, often rookie division quizmasters are some of your best quizmasters because they have great judgment like that. Sorry, Griffin has his hand up. Go ahead, Griffin.
I just want to make sure I am understanding Kristen's question correctly. And I think I probably misheard it, and because my mind is going into full tilt mode. We're not saying that you would write a question like word, interrogative, word, but rather it's okay if in the material there is an interrogative word that happens to be what or whatever. It just isn't the interrogative word, right?
Yes.
Okay,
yes.
great. Yes.
I mean, Kristen could speak to it. That's how I understood her.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and you understood correctly. I wrote those questions. I wrote the questions with the interrogative words at the start and the end, and the people who what. I wrote questions like that, and I had some complaints. So I wanted to make sure that I should write them still.
Okay, yeah, then yay, I understand and I agree with what everybody said.
Yeah, that's definitely worth covering as part of this presentation in the future. I really love the questions, everybody. So I don't want to cut any questions short at all. I also don't want this to go for 3 hours. And but that being said, I'll go for 3 hours. It'll all get put on the replay. So if someone has to leave, it's not the end of the world. So I'm going to keep answering questions and cruising along as fast as I can. But I want this all to be happening. So I'm going to have it keep happening. I have a long section on finish and quote questions. So I want to make sure we don't get too bogged down on interrogatives. So I'm going to move on. Please keep asking questions as we go. Multiple answer. Okay. So the rule of thumb with these, this is, as we all know, this is just an interrogative, but it has more than one answer. My way of doing this, and it is a rule of thumb and it is not an absolute rule, but what I do when checking for validity of a multiple answer is I ask myself if I can replace the interrogative word with 2 different whole words or phrases and both independently make like grammatical sense and also kind of just sense in general. Yeah, that's kind of the way to do it. You know, if it's he went to Jerusalem with James and John, with whom, with James, with John. And I would kind of do that exercise in my head. Does it make sense if we separate the answers out? And of course, you'll have times when there will be 2 logically connected ideas or one answer that leads to the next answer. So it might not make perfect theological sense if you separate the answers out. But if you separate them out and it makes like good grammatical sense and the question overall makes sense, then it's a multiple answer. But there are so many complicated sections when it comes to this. I chose to make this section short because I think the best way to learn all the edge cases of multiple answers is to just find some wonky question and throw it out and have people discuss it. That's what Griffin and Scott and I do all the time. And it is one of those iron sharpens iron things where we'll argue about it for a while and then someone will change their mind, but we might still disagree. That's just the reality. Grammar is kind of complicated. Multiple answers are kind of complicated. If it's an iffy question, probably just don't write it. That's, that's a good rule of thumb as well. But something that is a common error with multiple answers. Let's take the phrase, he has an inexpressible and glorious hope. In this phrase, what hope would be an MA? Because the answers would be inexpressible hope and glorious hope. There's 2 different qualities of this hope being described. But he has what would not be an MA because there's only one hope that he has. So that's one of those tricky things with multiple answers. You have to be paying attention to what is the interrogative word referring to in your question. And of course, this is often where the debates about those iffy MAs lie. So something to be conscious of. And now time for my theologically nitpicky pet peeve, which I am so thrilled to share with you all. This is definitely my opinion, except it's not because it's the difference between heresy and orthodoxy. If the word spirit is capitalized in the NIV, it's not a what, it's a who, theologically and logically, because it's a title for a person. So take the phrase, he will baptize you with the capital S Spirit and fire. He will baptize you with what is not an MA because the Spirit is not a what. I don't think it can be validly referred to as a what. And fire cannot be a whom. So how would we ask this? He will baptize you how is the way you ask this, with the Spirit and fire. So that is my nitpicky pet peeve. In an actual quiz, I would probably not throw it out because nobody else would, and I don't want to be the odd one out and providing an inconsistent quizzing experience. But I am on the warpath to make sure everyone understands that no matter how we interpret the verse, if the NIV uses a capital S, the quizzers should expect a whom. That's my thing. Heather, looks like you want to speak.
No, I mean, I agree with you theologically, although I think it goes against what we said about the builder and the house situation. But because you could, in this case, ask it as a how, I would, as a seasoned quizmaster that knows the material and feels confident about my own ability to quickly look it up and go, oh, it's still a valid question if I do this, I would just ask it differently because it's a good MA and I wouldn't want to keep it. And at internationals, there is not a chance that I'm actually going to get to the end of the question anyway. So I would just go ahead and ask it regardless. But I do recognize the need to not have these kinds of questions in the set. And so since we're catching things at the beginning here, if you are wanting to take your question writing to the next level, this is a great little nitpicky pet peeve to work with.
And if
But it's
a
an MA,
lowercase
so like
f,
we have to write every possible MA because there are not a lot of MAs. So it's I just never like the idea of like not taking the opportunity to think through how can I make this a valid MA and make sure it gets asked.
Sure, I guess, and this is where obviously you can see there's disagreement about this a little bit, because I would point out that the builder is not capitalized. The spirit is, right? And look, okay, Greek doesn't have capital letters. I could lecture about how in the Greek, etc., right? But in English, it's a capital S, so it's a title. It's a whom,
Yeah, sure, but the builder is a person. I mean, we could just use his name and be like Fred, and then we would still be using what? Like, I don't know what to tell you.
I would like to read that version, Fred the Builder.
Yeah, Fred built a house.
Yeah. So as I said, this is my nitpicky pet peeve. I think there should be a rule specifying that capital references to the spirit must be a who. I am alone in this. I throw this in there because I put a long time into putting this presentation together, so I get to do that. But recognizing this is my opinion, as I said, I would be making such distinctions. So moving on from multiple answers, now we're at the finish and quote questions. Oh my, this man is not happy to be looking at finish and quote questions. So there's a lot of complaints about these. And I think validly so, because I often myself have complaints with the way that finish and quote questions end up in a question set. And this is like at all levels of competition and back from when I was a quizzer as well. So, that might indicate there need to be rule changes, but in the meantime, I think we need to really up our game on these as question writers, so that we don't have coaches that look like the man in this photo or quizzers who look like the man in this photo. So that being said, talk about validity first. So finish the verse, finish these 2 verses, must be unique in the first 5 words, comparing to every other verse start. That's standard. Everyone in this chat knows that. Is it, unique in the first 5 words by all verse starts? Have at it, right? Finish this and the nexts, though, are a little weird to check validity for, because you're comparing them to every other valid, or every other, I shouldn't say valid, every other finish this in the material. So you're comparing it to all the sentence starts and all the quotation starts, which are in the middle of a verse, and only those that are in the middle of a verse. So when I check for these, I will just search for the whole 5-word phrase in the whole material. And if it pops up anywhere else, I'll check to make sure, it's not at the beginning of a verse, or it's not at the beginning of a sentence or a quotation that happens to be in the middle of a verse. Kind of a complex thing to say, but not too difficult to understand, I think.
Just means to finish this or finish this and the next can't start the same. So then they can't,
right.
You can't ask them. So they're no longer finish this.
And there's been a bit of a change with that from I tell you the truth in the old NIV to truly I tell you in the new one, which is only 4 words. So those are now valid. A little bit of a difference there, right? Quotes don't have any such restrictions. They're the easiest to think about. It can be on any verse. What's funny is there's no rule. I didn't even put a bullet point on it, but I'm going to say it. There's no rule actually prohibiting a finish these 2 verses from the end verse of one chapter to the first verse of the following chapter. However, I am unaware of any places where you would ever want to write that in any of the 8 quiz material years. If you find one, please let me know. I would love an example, but there is no rule against it. With quotes, however, I don't see how you would do that. You would have to say like, quote, Matthew chapter 1, verse 18, and 2, verse 1. And that is not the format of asking a quote question, so it would be invalid. Probably a useless thing to know, but it's good for us to know what's actually in the rules and what's not. Speaking of which, there's actually no rule saying you must use 5 words. You can use 1 word if it's a unique word. You can use 2 words, or actually, it wouldn't even have to be unique. It could be just the only verse that starts with that word. Now, there's no reason you would ever want to do less than 5 words unless the verse itself is less than 5 words. So there's this 1 Corinthians 16:14, do everything in love. You can ask to finish the verse on that, do everything in. And that's the whole question. You might not want to do that. You might want to just have a quote, because there'll probably be some coach who's going to get puzzled by it and protest or something. But then you can be like, haha, there's no rule, which says it has to be 5 words. So, you know, just so you know, those little nitpicky things about validity, good to know. So now we have validity. And finished quote questions are a little different because they have a whole category I like to call validity with quotation marks around it. The rule book has these rules about spiritual significance, which we are probably all familiar with. And I will go through those rules just so we have it in front of us. It must be strong enough to stand on its own without requiring additional verses to explain it. Must be of spiritual value or be significant to the chapter. Finish these 2 verses, finish this and the next are used when a verse is not strong enough on its own and needs another verse to explain it, or can be used when 2 verses combined form an even stronger thought. Continued. A pair of verses being used as a finish these 2 or finish this in the next does not preclude them from being used as an FTV or FT if they meet the remaining criteria. And lastly, excuse me, FTV questions should not start out with an insignificant introduction such as he replied or he said to them. These verses, if spiritually significant, should be used as finish this or finish this in the next type questions. Well, now that's all well and good, except here's the issue. Nobody really agrees what is spiritually significant on its own. Districts have completely different philosophies on what that means. What does on its own mean? What is spiritually significant? Isn't the whole Bible spiritually significant? And then finally, the rulebook says not to do things like Jesus answered as an FTV, do it as a finish this instead. But if one gets written, the quizzer doesn't really have recourse. It's not objectively invalid. The rulebook is just recommending it should not be done. It's not saying that it is illegal to do it or invalid to do it. So quizzers don't actually have any recourse against a poorly written finish and quote question set. And that is frustrating. So we have to write good ones. The onus is on us as question writers to make a good question set. And that is difficult, again, because of the difference in philosophy from one district to the next, from one question writer to the next. So my goal here is to start a conversation and to kind of throw out some things that I think we should all be able to agree on about finished quotes. That can hopefully lead us to, you know, and my hope is that there's more communication about this so quizzers aren't blindsided by a very different question set at internationals. Ethan, you got your hand raised.
Yes, and I think you might be talking about this, so maybe I shouldn't have raised my hand, but what has been PNW's general philosophy with this? Because I know you said it's different per district. What has been PNW's general philosophy for it?
Well, I've written the key verse list in PNW for like 7 years in a row now with input from others. But I think I've been the final one to compile it for quite a few years now with Griffin's approval. So whatever I say in this presentation is PNW's philosophy. Okay. But that being said, it's also kind of Heather's philosophy. We pretty much are in agreement on this. There's lots of people who feel the same way. And I'm also not going to get into certain details that are about the way I would do it, because A, I don't want to give this away to quizzers too much as someone who contributes to the set. And going to put this on YouTube, right? I don't want quizzers to be gaming it that way. But also B, there's more than one right way to do it. There's not a lot of, like, as I'm going to say, there's often several options, and you know what to me is the best pick is not going to be the same to someone else. So I'm going to keep this general and focus on the things that I think we can either infer from the rulebook directly or what is directly stated by the rulebook as good finish and quote question writing. And then I think from there, let the cards fall. And if there's a totally different question set from one district to the other, let's chat about it. And let's have a lot of contributors to the internationals question set so that there's a lot of feedback, if that makes sense. So
yeah, okay, thank you.
Certainly. Yeah. So here I have good, quote unquote, finish and quote questions. And I'll do some slides on this. So let's do some debunking first of some things I've heard or seen people kind of assume about these question types that I think are just not what the rule book is saying. The first point here, I've heard this many times. Every verse is spiritually significant, so it shouldn't matter, at least at the internationals level, what verses we ask. The clear problem with this is that the rulebook specifies in several different ways spiritually significant verses, significant to the chapter, stand on its own. There's quite a few criteria for selection of a finish the verse. And so just because the whole Bible is spiritually significant doesn't mean everything is spiritually significant by rulebook standards. And that's all that matters. What is the rulebook considering to be a spiritually significant verse, you know? And there's plenty of examples of stuff you should absolutely know in the Bible that makes terrible finish the verse questions. So that's kind of the idea here. I just think this is, to me, this statement comes from someone who hasn't read the rulebook language or hasn't considered it much. The rulebook strongly implies that there is a subset of verses we are supposed to be picking. And I hate it. It really bothers me when I see people who throw this out there as a defense of the verse, Jesus said this and left for Capernaum, as a finish the verse. That irks me to no end.
Yeah, well, the other side of that argument is that like every verse in a lot of ways requires context, so none of them can stand on their own. Like you could argue that back and forth for days and days, and we have, but that's not a valid argument in reality. That's the reason why quizzers can't challenge on it, because we would just be debating for too long to make a functional quiz happen. But that's not a good reason for us to just throw out good question writing principles.
Excellent. Yep. And like I said, that's why the onus is on us. So we got to do our job. This next one is not something I've heard anybody say, but I have seen a lot of question writing that operates as though it were true. So I will put it in someone's mouth, just like Paul does when he fights his imaginary debate partners in Romans. So finish these two verses and quote these two verses are only for when there's a comma at the end of the first verse. Nope. The rulebook says whenever the second verse adds strength to the spiritual significance of the first verse, it is valid to write it that way. This is definitely an area where the level of quizzing matters. At internationals, if the second verse improves the first verse in its meaning, I think it should be a finish these two verses. We're supposed to be testing them. It should be hard. At the district level, I'm thinking of, because we write a key verse list, and all of our finish questions and quote questions come from that list. So I craft the list to be pedagogical. I'm thinking some quizzer who's not going to memorize all of it is going to memorize this list, and I want this list to cover all of the like theological concepts in Romans and the main verses. That's not what internationals question writing is like. So in that case, you know, I would do a lot more finish the verses and try to make it a little easier at the district. But at internationals, I'm just trying to ask the question, does this need the next verse to explain it? Is it better when paired with the next verse? Is there more significance? If so, I'm adding the second verse. If the next verse is changing the topic or something totally different, then it's a finish the verse. That's kind of my philosophy. There's a lot of gray area there, certainly. And that's fine. But I do see finish these two verses kind of underutilized at the internationals level, when I think they should be a pretty hefty portion of the question set. I think it should be normal to hear one or two finish these two verses in each quiz at internationals, I think. So that's just my 2 cents on that. And then lastly, the rulebook says we can write the same verse as both an FTV and a finish the verse and a finish these two verses. Therefore, we should do it often. Well, the rulebook does say you can do that. You shouldn't do it often, though. I have a few examples of this down the line, so I'm not going to elaborate here. You can do it, and there are circumstances you may want to do it. I have, however, seen question sets where the question writer will just write, like every finish these two verses, they will do both a finish the verse on verse 1 and verse 2, and also a finish these two verses for both verses. The problem with that is that the rulebook strongly implies that there there are better ways to ask these questions than other ways. We might debate about what the best way to ask a verse is, which subtype is ideal, but the rulebook implies there is a best way in most instances. I think it implies that because it's talking about if it's stronger with the two verses, if it needs this to explain it, etc. You should use a finish this in this instance. So I think it implies that we should mostly be selecting what we think is ideal. I think of it like a puzzle. I'm trying to piece all the verses in the material into these subtypes, and I'm not trying to have overlap unless there's really good warrant for it. That's another one of those instances where if you start doing that, finish the verse and finish these two verses thing, you skew the question set toward particular verses a lot, and in a way that's unnatural, I think, from the perspective of the rulebook. So I have some examples later. Let's move on to selecting verses. I already touched on district key verse lists. It's a teaching tool. It's pedagogy, right? What verses do I want the low to mid-tier quizzers to know first before they know the whole material? For internationals, most quizzers already know every verse. So you should include all the verses you feel are spiritually significant on their own. You don't need to include a bunch of borderline stuff, but if you think it meets the criteria well, you should pick it. It shouldn't just be Club 150, Club 300. Some districts focus a lot on that. They're great, again, but I think they're teaching tools. The rulebook doesn't say anything about Club 150, Club 300, and the quizzers who are preparing for internationals, according to the rulebook, should expect all spiritually significant verses to show up, right? So I would say if it's good, include it. Don't think about how many you're including. Sometimes you'll reach a chapter like Romans 16 with the greetings where you're not going to probably put any of those in there, or at least not most of them, and that's fine. You don't need to worry about like a quota per chapter or something like that. If it's good, write it. If it's not, don't.
I would actually also say that as a question writer, just in terms of functionality of this, if you are writing questions for a district set, then of course you might want to have the key verse list in front of you because of the way that district runs their quizzes. But if you're writing for the international set, I would argue that it is actually just better not to have that set. Don't cross-reference with it, because if you're using your judgment to go writing every solid verse, then you're going to get a lot that are in that set, and that's fine, but you're also not going to let that set skew the way that you're choosing your verses, and you'll be more consistent.
Yeah, I don't want there to be any cross-pollination between district key verse lists and the question writing at internationals, because that indirectly favors certain districts, right? Now, inevitably, the people writing the questions are going to have a district flair to it. That's not perfectly avoidable. That's why we want to encourage as many people as possible to be part of the process from as many different districts. But certainly, if I write the PNW district key verse list and then I'm asked to also do an internationals one, which I have done before, I don't reference it at all. I make a brand new thing, and they're very different. I think I haven't compared them. I think they would end up very different because I'm not thinking of pedagogy. I'm thinking, oh, literally everything in Romans 8 is a key verse. So it's all going in there. I'm not picking the best 15 to throw at rookies, ends up very different. Ethan, could you wait till I'm done with this slide and then
Yes, sorry.
I'll answer. No problem. Yeah, I just want to get through these last few points. Avoid only going for the precious moments verses. That's the way I put it. It's wonderful that the Bible says we should love one another and all that, but God's wrath is also spiritually significant. Vice lists in Paul's letters are super spiritually significant. It doesn't just have to be the fruit of the Spirit verse. You could also do the verses before, which talk about all the evil things people do. Very spiritually significant. Don't fail to include those. I think that kind of goes without saying, but I just threw it in there because to me, that's important. So, and then the last points I have here are just kind of about the ratio of finished questions. I mentioned this already with the best 150/300. Narrative years might only use, 50% of the material because you've got a lot of those, Jesus went here and did this, or then the Pharisees said to him, we don't like you. And that's not really spiritually significant on its own, whereas James and Romans or Gepka, those two material years, other than the greetings in Romans 16, the whole dang thing is a key verse. I can't think of anything that wouldn't be. It's all spiritually significant. Some is better than others, but you know, it doesn't all have to be Romans 3:23 to meet the criteria of spiritually significant and stands on its own. And if it does meet that criteria, I'm writing it as a key verse at internationals. So so yeah, barring particular, you know, openings and salutations and stuff, James and Romans is just like pure key verse. And then you got like Corinthians and Hebrews, Peter years are probably somewhere in the middle, because Paul does a lot more kind of logistics stuff in Corinthians. And then Hebrews and Peter, you've got like descriptions of the sacrificial system of the Old Testament that by themselves probably not super spiritually significant, although, you know, you'd be surprised. A lot more of Hebrews 7, I think, qualifies than people think with the Melchizedek stuff. But so they're probably somewhere in the middle. So that's just to say, like, you don't feel like you need to make any quotas with this stuff. The principle is, if it's good, write it. That's all. So, Ethan, your question.
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to quickly ask, so the you said that James and Romans, as you said, they're pure key verses, and you said to don't worry about it, but is there some kind of limit where you think, where you should be thinking, okay, maybe we should stop making more, or is there some kind of verse limit that we would have to do, not go crazy or something?
In the district, of course, I'm going to write a particular number of verses that I think are manageable for, you know, a certain level of quizzer to master.
Okay.
Internationals, all bets are off. If it meets the criteria, it's going in the list, period.
Okay, so internationals, it doesn't matter. Okay.
Yep.
Thank you.
Yep. Yeah, it's whatever. And it's like I said, pick the material or pick the question type that best suits the material. In James and Romans, goodness gracious, finish the verses everywhere, you know. Now, there's not going to be more finish the verse questions in James and Romans. It's still going to have the same distribution, but the quizzers who want to study the finish the verse list are going to have to study all those verses. I want them to have to do that. Whatever the material is lending itself to, that's what I want the question set to reflect. So yeah, and those are, I totally threw those numbers out randomly. I don't know if it's 90%, but it's hard for me to think of anything in Romans that's not, you know, that's not spiritually significant. James is even worse in that way. It's like the whole thing is just wonderful. So, okay, so a little more on selecting verses. I think it's worth pointing out some of the tougher passages to write these on. These are the ones I have trouble with. Parables are often spiritually significant, of course, but you need the whole story to get it. So it can be tough to write these. You know, you'll have like the Good Samaritan handing a couple coins to the innkeeper. It's like, well, so that part's not spiritually significant, but the fact that he's paying for the the man's health care is probably a good thing, that he's helping out his fellow citizen and doing acts of charity, you know. So that can be tough. A lot of the time with parables, there will be a punchy kind of lesson at the end of the parable, and I'll write that as the finish the verse and ignore the rest. It just depends. So there's stuff in Matthew, for example, where it's all these details about, like, you know, the wedding banquet and stuff, but then the last verse will say, and the last will be first and the first will be last. And that verse is what I'll pick, because none of the parable details really stand on their own as a spiritually significant statement, which hurts me so bad, because it's hard to get more spiritually significant than parables, but it just doesn't fit the question type. So my son is screaming in the background. That's probably coming through on the recording a bit. But okay, so moving on. Any place where narratives drive the spiritual significance. So outside of parables, you've got like the crucifixion story is always hard to write key verses on, because the whole thing is like the central event of the Christian faith, but I don't know, like piercing him with a spear, is that spiritually significant on its own? It's kind of the whole event, right? That's significant. And so I find those tricky. But you know, I think there's going to be a lot of room for disagreement on how to approach these passages, and particularly because of the important to the chapter part of the rule book, I'm going to probably write some of these as finish the verses, because they have some important narrative details about the crucifixion or the resurrection, or, you know, healing people. Sometimes you might want to include more than just the summary statement of he healed the people and cast out demons. There might be some other parts of the narrative that are details but are also spiritually significant. Use your best judgment, I think, and these are tricky. And then lastly, Paul's run on sentences, not so much difficult because of spiritual significance because they're typically very significant, but I think more because it's just a long run sentence and it's hard to pick which subtypes, match the verses. So, all right, what does it mean for a verse to stand on its own? Who knows? I don't know. I would say don't read too much into the rule. For example, if it says he was crucified for our sins, but the verse doesn't say Jesus, okay, I think it's reasonable to assume quizzers have a general knowledge of the Bible and Christian doctrine and the material being studied. So I think that still counts as a finish the verse, even though it doesn't really quite stand on its own. That's what I mean by don't read too much into it. I think what this rule is more getting at is don't get like cute with it and include verses which are like super significant, but only when you take the whole like thing into account. And so like that would be something like Paul's travels in the book of Acts. Like that's really important that Luke wrote that, and you do need, like, Christians need to know it. I want the quizzers to know it, but it's like Paul left Iconium and went to Lystra is not by itself spiritually significant. I think that's kind of what this rule is more about than like reading super hard into it and requiring that every little detail of the verse is self-explained. I don't think that's what it is. So picking subtypes. There's several ways to do it most of the time. Use your best judgment. I've mentioned finish these twos being underutilized. Finish this and finish this in the next is usually used for he replied or as it is written, but not always. And so here's an example that I found. Romans 3:4 starts with this not at all, which Paul uses a lot in Romans. Let God be true and every human being a liar, as it is written, so that you may be proved right when you speak and prevail when you judge. Now you could start this as a finish this at the so that you may be proved right, the as it is written section. But I think this verse is better if you just cut out the not at all part, because we don't know what Paul is saying not at all to, unless you do finish these two with the previous verse, which is also a reasonable option here. But in this case, I would say cut out that first interjection and start as a finish this at let God be true. I think that's the best way to do this. That's one example. It's not always those quotations. That being said, you can also overuse them. If the first part of the verse is super like significant and there just happens to be two sentences in the verse, I don't think there's any reason to write a finish this on the second verse or the second sentence of the verse. Just do the whole verse. So don't overuse it, but don't underuse it. If you see these little weird examples like Romans 3:4, feel free to do it outside of the normal it is written and he answered type stuff. There's a really weird example in Ephesians 1 where the verse ends with like two words at the beginning of a sentence. It's like the in love verse break, he predestined us for adoption as sons. That's like a great finish this and the next. It's a really weird one because the first 5 words go into the second verse. But so there's weird stuff like that you might find. All right, so going back to the whole concept of using multiple subtypes to ask the same verse, I'm going to give a few examples of where you might want to do this, because I already mentioned the finish the verse and finish these two on the same thing is usually bad, right? Here's a good example of, I think, where I would use a verse twice. You've got this, I tell you, Christ has become a servant of the Jews, blah, blah, blah. And moreover, there's the verse break, that the Gentiles might glorify God for his mercy. As it is written, therefore I will praise you among the Gentiles. And so this is a great finish these two. I mean, the verse 8 ends in the middle of a sentence and the next verse, it's just great. It's spiritually significant. Excellent. Let's ask it, right? But then I might notice here that this last part of verse 9 is a really good finish this with this with this snippet. It's on its own and it's at the end of the verse. And just to switch things up here, I might do a finish these two and a finish this on the second verse. So there's some examples of this. They're rare, but they're out there. But I probably would not do like a quote on the second verse because it starts in the middle of a sentence. So I might vary it up and not do both a quote and a finish for the same verse, which normally you would kind of just copy the question type over, but not here.
Jeremy, I have a quick question for you. You
Mhm.
said you'd write this as a finish two verses or quote two verses. Would you ever write it as both, and why?
I would write it as both and then do just the finish this on the second verse. So I would do all three. I would not do, yeah, I don't want to overemphasize a verse just because it has these qualities to it. So I probably wouldn't do two quotes.
Right. So, but to be clear, you're not, when you're talking about like overlapping types, you're not ever talking about having a finish and a quote. Most of the time, if it's a finish, it can also be a quote.
Yeah, and when I do question writing, I copy over my finish the verse types into quotes for everything except these weird circumstances. Uh, I don't ever. So the exception, of course, if a verse doesn't start with a valid finish start, I'll just do a quote, of course. If it yeah, or if it's a finish this, I'll translate it to a quote because it'll usually start with a "it is written" or a "he said," or finish this in the next. I'll transfer it to a quote. These two, yeah, you can just save yourself time there because you've already decided they're better paired together. So just pair them together for the quotes, right? There's not much reason to go back and forth, uh, except in this sort of circumstance where I don't want to overemphasize a section just because I thought it would also be a good secondary subtype. Here's another example. I have this in the slides. Look at this, the "in love he predestined us" verse. But I have this written as doing two separate finish these two verses with consecutive verses. So you have verse 4, 5, and 6. And because this is all kind of one continuous idea with sentences that don't end, it's one of those Paul's run-on sentences things. I would actually tackle this and maybe do verses 4 and 5 as a finish quote two, and then verses 5 and 6 as a finish quote two. Like I mentioned, I might also throw a finish this and the next in there instead of doing 4 and 5 as a finish these two. Kind of however I see it, working best. But yeah, so you might see three verses in a row that work as two separate finish these twos, and that's another instance in which I would use a verse twice. Cool. Okay, so finish quote questions. That was like a lot. Any questions before we move on? We have two more types to cover, and they're not as beefy as the finish quotes. So we are winding down. Hopefully, I'm gonna drink some water. All right. So reference questions, validity. Review for all of us, I'm sure. For chapter references, the question text minus the interrogative word, you can take that right out of there, must be used identically elsewhere in the material, but never within the chapter that the question comes from. So it's got to be, not valid as an interrogative, identical material elsewhere, but not within the chapter. And then chapter verse references has to be identical within the chapter in a different verse, and whatever happens in the rest of the material is irrelevant, just within that chapter. A few details maybe people haven't considered is that chapter references can span multiple verses, just like ordinary interrogatives and multiple answers. There's no, like, context is 5 verses in a chapter reference, right? So consider that. I mean, you would probably never write one that spans 5 verses, but maybe it will go into the next verse, for example, or clarification might be a few verses earlier. And that's totally kosher with chapter references. Chapter verse references must be completely within one verse, though, and that includes any clarifications you use. Because if the quizzer quotes anything outside of the verse, they're out of context. Context is one verse in CVRs. So usually, I rarely include clarifications in CVRs because they are very tough to do at the style of internationals question writing, and how the people jump as early as they do. So yeah, sorry, I'm gonna, 1 second. Let's see if I can mute. All right, sorry about that. Can everyone hear me? Cool, okay. My son is ready to go outside. That's the deal, I think. Okay, so one possible misconception I've heard people say is, hey, like if the subtype of the question, say because it's an MACR instead of a single answer CR, or the choice of the interrogative word, say because it's a what and not a who, uh, the quizzer can know it, even though it's the same phrase uh, as elsewhere within the chapter or whatever. Uh, but the rulebook doesn't say that those affect validity. Only the words that are part of the material affect validity. So if one of the verses says he passed through the Red Sea, and the other one says he passed on to heaven or something, like even though the phrasing is like super different in those two verses, and you might have a different interrogative word, he passed where, he passed how, or something, uh, just because the quizzer can know it doesn't make it valid. So I've heard that several times. I don't know where that came from because it's nowhere in the rule book or in any previous edition of the rule book. So yeah, I've also heard before that, like, oh, hey, it doesn't matter past the fifth word if it includes different material. Again, not in the rule book. The whole phrase minus the whole question minus the interrogative word needs to appear identically elsewhere for it to be a reference question. It doesn't matter if it's an invalid interrogative. That by itself does not make it a valid reference. So good to clarify those. Some things to consider when writing a good reference set. There are plenty of good chapter references. Don't write bad ones. There's a lot of them, easily hundreds and hundreds and hundreds. So don't write bad ones. And an example of a bad CR would be something that's excessively vague. So like, he will what? Just because that's a chapter unique phrase doesn't make it a good CR. Those are good CVRs whenever they're valid as CVRs, not so much as CRs. So be conscious of that. Like I said, let's write hard questions. Yes, I know I said that. But vague is not the same thing as hard. If a quizzer has memorized the chapter, they should be able to get the CR if they know the whole question. Now, if they pre-jump and don't recognize it, well, that's part of the competition. But like, if it's a bonus question and someone who can quote the whole chapter back and front can't get it in 30 seconds, it's a bad question. So we want to reward material knowledge, not picking out random phrases like he will what in a whole chapter. Here's one I see a lot of. This is something I'd like to improve in question writing across the board. If there's a reference question that's answered with the same answer every time it appears, then it's not actually serving the purpose of reference questions. The purpose, as it's stated in the rulebook, is to distinguish between similar material appearing in different contexts. I think that's like verbatim the rulebook. Similar material appearing in different contexts, not the same material appearing in different contexts. Back in the day, there was the cross-reference question type, and the purpose of those was to target these instances where it's always like the same answer. We don't have those anymore, and the remaining question types don't have a good way of targeting those. Don't write references on that. Like the kingdom of whom, if it's always God, it's just not really testing much. The quizzers are basically just guessing, and they don't know the verse. They could just jump and guess, at the district level. It's just not asking anything too substantive about the material. But maybe there's one verse that says the kingdom of heaven. Well, now you have a more interesting scenario. You might want to write a reference on that verse and then pick like a couple of the kingdom of God instances and write a question on that. So that you've got kind of a varied question set that asks different things about the material. But not all of them, because then you end up with 30 the kingdom of whoms when we do Luke. And it's skewing the question set to easy questions that aren't asking anything actually, So yeah, use your best judgment on that. Last point here, ideally your question set is around 50-50 CR CVR. That being said, some material lends itself better to one or the other. That's been a meta theme of this seminar. So that's not a rule. I just try to balance it that way. And what that means is I'm not writing as many chapter reference questions because there's way more of them than there are chapter verse references. So I'm picking better chapter references. This is another place where I think the rules can change. CRs and CVRs are so different in how quizzers answer them that I think they should have different distributions in the quiz. That's my opinion. But until then, they're all lumped together as one. So I don't want to end up with like every other quiz only having CRs because they get shuffled together. I want them to be about 50-50 or at least something like 65-35 and not like 90-10 or I don't know. There's some materials where there's lots of CRs. So just consider that ratio while you're making your set. And one last thing to consider with reference questions is that the best and most important ones to write are the hardest ones to find. The he, will, whats are always easy to find for CVRs, but there's so many good ones. And you actually have to kind of know the material and pay attention to it to find them, or at least search it well with a searchable online material to find stuff like every tree that does not what. Romans 7 or Romans, it is 7. If I do what I do not want, what? That's a great reference question because it's like a totally different answer in two different verses with this long phrase. Then you've got stuff like after Jesus had finished saying these things, he what? Jesus went up on a mountainside when? These kind of longer phrases. This is actually getting more at the point of references. So this is really what we want to be asking. That's not to say you shouldn't have you are what as a CVR from time to time. There's plenty of great ones to throw in there, but don't miss the good ones. When you write references, really interact with the material, search it, and read it. You're not just looking at phrases, but understand these repetitive concepts as they come up. I know I was ragging on the kingdom of God as a reference earlier, but in Matthew, the longer question, the kingdom of heaven is like what, is a great reference question. And I've seen it asked as the kingdom of what before. It just makes me so, because you've got such a good question staring you in the face there. The kingdom of heaven is like what? So pay attention to those. A good question set will include all those good ones. So that's references. Any questions? Kristen has one.
So I was told at internationals by, I can't remember who, that when we're writing reference questions, especially chapter verse references, we should make the questions stem as long as possible. So if there's an and or a for, we should include it. Is that still the philosophy?
That's not my philosophy. That would be an opinion thing. I strongly disagree. I think it should be as long as possible. That is like a good question. So
I agree with Jeremy, as long as possible on the back end, but not on the front end. Like we don't need to have random filler phrases at the beginning, especially because in practice and how we execute the rule for correct answers, if a quizzer said everything except the and at the beginning and then created the question correctly without the and at the beginning, we would still call them correct. So it's kind of a useless, unnecessary piece. I would say don't put the stuff at the beginning, but definitely make it like if you can have the kingdom of what, but you could also have the kingdom of heaven is like what, we should make it long on the back end.
Yeah, and I think that I can see the logic there because the idea is let's have the phrase be the whole like repetitive phrase because the whole point is to have these repeated phrases. Like quizzers should know which ones are repeated. I get the logic. But at the end of the day, there's also like writing a question that is phrased well. And at the district level, that would irk me. Like Heather said, at the internationals level, maybe not so much because like in practice, it's irrelevant. But you know, it might still come up on a bonus and I don't want quizzers to hear a poorly written question on the bonus. But that being said, that is an opinion thing. Like I get the logic there. I would not write questions that way. So that's me distinguishing and trying not to sound arrogant, but I do actually quite strongly disagree. So
I also very strongly disagree. So I'm glad to hear that I don't have to do it that way.
I figured you would, Kristen, because you have good question writing sense. But and I'm not trying to bad talk anybody. I don't know who said that, but I just disagree is all. Okay, So if there are no more questions, situations are the last one. These are my favorite question type, full disclosure. I know that some people who may or may not be present with us, it's their least favorite. I know Griffin and Scott have badmouthed it on the Inside Quizzing podcast because of how gray area situations are. That's why I love them. They are a lot more, there's a lot more latitude to the question writer with situations. So let's use the latitude well. I think that's my encouragement. But so first of all, validity must be unique in the first 5 words when compared to other situation questions. And this is the toughest one to check for because situations are the only question type where there can be non-continuous text in the question. So in the example I have here, this verse from Matthew 17 says, "What do you think, Simon?" He asked. "From whom do the kings of the earth collect duty and taxes?" Now, when you write this as a situation, you don't put the "he asked" there, but you can just concatenate the 2 parts of the verse into one quotation. You're allowed to do that. So that makes it a little tricky because you do have places. Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry,
Kevin.
you're not just allowed to do that. You must do that. You can't put the "he asked" in there. There is no allowed. It must not happen.
Well, of course, in this circumstance, you could actually stop the quotation at the word Simon. But yes, if you're going to proceed from Simon, you must do it. So there are circumstances where the first 2 words of the question the quotation will happen, and then it'll get interrupted with a "Jesus said." And in those instances, you might have to do some searching, some creative searching to check validity. So something to be aware of. You can start the question at the start of any sentence in the first 2 verses of the quotation. So if the first sentence is a "truly I tell you," that is valid now. You may not want to always do that. Maybe the second sentence is great too. I know I said that you should write those anyways, and you should, but maybe not all of them, because that might skew the question set too much in that direction. So you may want to start at the second sentence, or maybe the first sentence is just straight up invalid. Okay, now you can start with the second one. So good to be aware of that. And you can start it, so you can have the quotation be as long as 2 verses from the start of your question. So what that means is you could go to the end of verse 3 of the overall quotation in the text if you start at verse 2 somewhere. I don't know, it's kind of confusing there, but one of those things you get the hang of. And up to 3 questions can be asked, even if there's more than 3. If there's a "who said it," "when was it said," "where was it said," and "how," and they're all great, you got to pick 3. In which case I would pretty much always do "who said it" and "to whom" if there is one, and then I would just pick my favorite of the third. "Who" and "to whom" are kind of the standard basic ones, so I would go with those first. But yeah, so you have to cap it at 3. That is a rule that I want to change at internationals level, but this isn't about my opinions on the rules. Let's proceed. So here's a question that comes up a lot. This rule in the rule book: it must be a direct quotation from scripture by a person or an entity. There's a debate here about what direct quotation means. Is it saying that like a quotation of the Old Testament is invalid as a situation? Or if Jesus is telling a parable and it's an indirect quotation of a character in the parable saying something, but it's not a real person, does that count? I certainly think it does. I don't always think it's great to write situations on the Old Testament quotes, but certainly in the parables, the father saying something to the son in a parable, that's definitely a great situation. I think this phrase "direct quotations" being a little overinterpreted. I think all it's saying is it has to come from scripture. I think it's a poorly phrased way of saying that people might be overinterpreting. That is my interpretation of it. There are people who really like the rule book who disagree. So I just think it needs to be amended to be clear one way or the other. But as far as I'm concerned, it just means it got to come from scripture and it's got to be a quote from somebody. So if it's an Old Testament quotation and it just says "it is written," I'm not going to write a situation on that because it doesn't specify a person or an entity. But if it says "it was said by Isaiah speaking through the Holy Spirit," then I would write that as a "who said it," and "how was it said?" Isaiah through the Holy Spirit. So That's my interpretation of the rule, at least. The various questions you can ask in a situation: who said it? Obviously. To whom was it said? How was it said? A little bit of debate on here as well. My opinion is that this is talking about a manner of speaking and not like the attending circumstances of the quotation. That's kind of hard to, an example is better. So shouted would be a how. Jesus shouted, how was it said? But if it says Jesus walked along the lake and said to them, that's not really a how. I've seen sometimes that being asked as a how, because he's walking and talking, but the walking is not part of the speaking, even though it's happening alongside it. So I don't consider that a how. I do consider it a where. So you should write that as at the lake, or along the lake, rather, as I have it written here. I just made up that verse, but if it says something like that, do a where for sure. But it's hard to fully explain that. But consider: is this how the person's talking, or is it something related? There's a verse in John that says Jesus stood up and said in a loud voice. So that one I would do who said it and how, but the stood up would not be part of the answer, right? Because it's really not the, how he's speaking it.
How tends in a lot of circumstances, question writers tend to use how as a catch-all for when, where, and why. Like we end up getting a lot of like, oh, I don't really know what to say, so I'm going to say how because it feels like a catch-all, but it's not. And I 1,000,000% agree with Jeremy's opinion on this. And because we both agree, I would like to say it's fact, not just an opinion, but that's its own up for debate. It's fine. I for sure this is a where, and the fact that he was walking has nothing to do with nothing to do with how it's been said or the speaking at all. And I would also add that in practice, we generally don't ask. Even something like asked is generally not a how. It needs to be a manner of speaking that's a little bit more interesting than asked.
Yeah, I will cover that a little bit in the next slide.
Oh, sorry.
So that's totally fine. Yeah, I agree. I'll leave it at that for now. So when, where, why was it said? These are kind of self-explanatory, but consider that these are often found in the surrounding context and not usually in the verse itself. So include these when you're writing for internationals in particular. Include them wherever they appear. Like the whole point of these questions is that the quizzer should know that it was in Capernaum that Jesus said it. I actually kind of would be cool with getting rid of the context rule with situations personally because of this. Like, I think the quizzer should know he's still in Capernaum, even though it's a chapter later, and I wouldn't want to get crazy with that. But the point being that when I like to write situations by themselves. So like when I do interrogatives or MAs, I will kind of do them at the same time. I'll tackle one verse at a time. With situations and also with finish and quote, there's such a different mode of question writing that I just don't do them at the same time. I'm scanning the material, looking for quotations, and when I see them, I examine the whole surrounding context. And if I see something like it was the last day of the festival, that's going in the question if it's in context, writing for internationals. So please include those, because those are really getting at the more detailed questions that we want the internationals quizzers to be tested on. I see way too many who said it and to whom's when there's a third one to be thrown in there. So then lastly, we have this funky one about whom was it said. There's not a lot of these. There's a few places where it will specifically say he said this about, Jesus or whatever. But it kind of leads into my next point. Oh, sorry, not my next point. Maybe I'll skip ahead and do that one later. My next point was there are implied answers to situations, and this is kind of a different thing than other question types. This is the gray area part I was talking about. Situations have implied answers a lot, and it's okay as long as they're unambiguous and clear. Another way of understanding that would be they don't require the quizzer to interpret the meaning of the text. They just require the quizzer to know the English language and have memorized the verses, right? So if you have a Jesus replied, it is reasonable to expect the quizzer to know who he's replying to. If it's like the disciples said to Jesus, "This is crazy." Jesus replied, "No, it's not." Then you can do a who to whom, Jesus to the disciples, if it says Jesus replied, and the same goes with answered and asked. And I see all of those terms as to whom's and not how's, because of what Heather said. They're just not very significant and meaningful. Those are used hundreds of times in the Gospels and Acts, so they're just not very interesting. It's not invalid. You can do them as a how, but I just don't think they're very good. That's my personal opinion. I would do it to whom, though, if it's clear in the context who he's talking to. So you don't need some phrase saying he said it to them if the verb implies it. If it just says Jesus said, I wouldn't do a to whom, even if the context is clear. That sometimes happens where there's a discussion back and forth and it'll just say he said it. I wouldn't do it there, even though I don't know that it would be invalid, just because it does require a little more interpretation. So I'd be cautious of that. Then we have this about whom as well. These could also be implied, but be very cautious about it because it's really rare that it works well. You will have like a quote where there's a pronoun, a he, and there's only one he in the verse referred to, but the he is not identified in the quote itself. That could be a time to do an about whom, but it has to be unambiguous and clear. Like any quizzer who understands the English language needs to be able to get it. It needs to be something they can understand clearly. So that's kind of my game plan for those. All right, go back to this because I think it's a good example of why you need to examine the context. You've got this Isaiah quote. Isaiah says elsewhere, blah, 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 blah. And then the following verse says, Isaiah said this because he saw Jesus's glory and spoke about him. So here is a who said it, why was it said, and about whom was it said. And you wouldn't see the why and the about whom unless you read the surrounding context, right? So you got both of those right there, but so many people would just do this as a who said it because they're not paying attention to that context.
Or they would do who said it and where, and that would just be like elsewhere.
Much lamer,
really?
Yeah, much lamer than
Really?
the two there. That's a good point. Now, that would be fine.
Yeah,
if there
it's fine.
weren't three great ones already.
Totally. It's a big miss, swing and a miss.
Yeah, so valid, but not good. So that's a little demonstration of why you got to pay attention. Okay, I think this might be the end of situations here. And this is basically my spiel for make hard questions at internationals. Don't hold back. These can be the most difficult question type. And I think that's awesome. They should be. So you can write multiple questions on the same quotation. Obviously, that's valid. I would only do that if there's like a change of topic. Like Jesus is still speaking, but the second sentence is like some wildly different thing. Then you do two different ones, I would say. That's how I'd do it. But you don't need to write a question at all the different sentence starts if they're all part of the same idea. You can use up to 2 full verses, and you should if it's on the same topic for internationals. This is a huge difference. I don't do that at district level writing. So something to keep in mind. We want them to have to give us as much material as the rulebook permits us to let them give us. I mean, it's internationals. You need to quote it quickly and accurately. I don't know what to say. I don't agree with the philosophy that it should be easy. So, and then I just when writing like a whole set of situations, I include every quotation. This isn't like finish the verses where it has to be significant. So even if the quotation is just like, no, you won't, I'll put it in there because, I want them to know who said that. And it doesn't need to stand on its own or anything. I would include every quotation unless there's nothing meaningful to ask about it. Like they said, but there's no clarification of they in context, that kind of thing. Or unless it's invalid, obviously. I write every single quotation. I think quizzers should expect that. Any questions on situations? We're going a while. We're just about done. All right, so here's my plug at the end here for Quizzing Academy, which is the project that Heather and I are undertaking to swap from doing this kind of ad hoc, who wants to submit questions to internationals thing, to an ongoing group that is kind of like people who have contributed or are interested in contributing to the Internationals question set. We have kind of like a list of people who on some level are in regular communication, which doesn't necessarily mean we're having powwows all the time, but we do have a Slack channel that I'd like to invite people to participate in, where we can throw difficult questions on there and have people discuss them. Or people can ask questions about this or that, talk about question writing, editing, rules that might need to be changed if we think it would help the question set or whatever. Giving each other feedback. Heather and I have an idea of kind of reviewing people's sets and giving constructive criticism. All this stuff is sort of in the germ phase, we might say, but we're hoping it becomes infectious. So we will have that Slack channel set up. We're hoping to keep this group ongoing, and it'll change over time so that we have a group of people who we can kind of peg to write questions, and we have some expectation of the quality we'll be getting and the various styles, and we can also kind of sharpen one another. The goal is to improve the question set and coach quizzer contentment. We would like to not have the complaints about finished questions every single year at Internationals. That'd be excellent. I think Heather's question set process, the way she constructs it, is excellent. I think it's really good. We just need to improve each other as far as question writing goes, and work hard on it. I think that's where our fly in the ointment is, if you will.
Our single biggest issue is too few people maybe feeling comfortable with the concept of writing a question. So the goal of this project is to increase, well, the overall goal is on the screen, but our like smaller goal in how we get to that goal is how do we like increase people's comfort level with writing questions and feeling good about the fact that like we're not all fabulous at writing every question type, and it's okay to not be amazing at it. And I personally don't do a great job if I spend too long at it. Like I'll eventually get into like a weird hole of like, wow, this is a terrible question that I wrote at 2 a.m. It seemed awesome at the time. And it's good to have people's opinions to like you said, iron sharpens iron.
100%. For resources, like I said, we're not going to cover how to use tools to question write, even though a lot of people, that is a barrier for them. It's just too much. I mean, it's been going on for 2 hours. We don't have time to do that all in this presentation, but I have here the link to CBQZ, and direct all your questions about CBQZ to Griffin. It is an excellent question writing tool that looks a little intimidating until you see someone use it for 5 minutes, and then it's pretty simple. So I highly recommend that to you. And then for Inside Quizzing podcast, I put a couple links here. You're not going to be able to remember those, but I will send out the PowerPoint. So you can click, or you can just search for it on your favorite podcasting app. Griffin and Scott are just as nerdy as Heather and I, and love to discuss all things question validity, question sets. They talk about it frequently and come up with the most absurd corner case things to nerd out about. It is a great listen. I listen to it while I do the dishes and drive the car. So, I recommend that to you if you want to be part of this world of, getting in the weeds of question writing. And lastly, well, it wouldn't be a quizzing academy if there wasn't some homework that, so this is, it makes it sound scary, but Heather and I wanted to put together, and Heather's the one who actually did it, so I shouldn't say and I. Heather put together a short little Google form that you can work through with some weird questions on it, and we want to be able to give people feedback on their question writing foo, so you can identify, is the question good or bad, is it valid, invalid, that kind of thing. And we want to give kind of like detailed feedback, what we think. And so Heather, I didn't actually put the link to it here, but we're going to be posting it up, and you can put it in the chat now if you've got it.
Yep, just let me pull it up. One of the things, can I just say quickly about it? One of the things to keep in mind is that it's sort of designed to allow you to choose if you wouldn't necessarily be ever interested in writing a particular question type, this piece of homework is sort of designed to let you choose. So if you don't want to do, if you don't want to do references, for example, then you just would never, just don't fill that bit out. Like you can select into and out of it. So hopefully it works pretty well. Do I need to say more, or should I, like, what do you
I think
want?
that's fine. Our idea is that people who want to contribute to the Internationals question set will do it, because it's not going to take you very long, and it's really helpful to us to know like areas that you might be struggling in, or just like if you knock it out of the park, awesome, or just letting us know, I hate writing situation questions, like excellent, cool, good stuff, all fine. It's I mean, I don't know a better word for it than homework, but it's really not scary. The point is to be able to help each other.
Yeah.
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 I'm going to stop sharing the screen now because that's the last slide. Looks like there's been a lively discussion of in the chat that I wasn't able to see. I was screen sharing. Thank you for not making the question writers heretics, Jeremy.
Yeah.
Excellent. Okay. Well, that being said, any final questions? Looks like Heather put the form there, so please check that out.
Griffin has a question.
This is going back to the very, very beginning, or well, maybe it was slide 2 or something, but I think there was something where you had talked about negative answer prohibition being related to interrogatives, and I think it's actually only multiple answers.
It's both. We had this argument already, Griffin.
Where does it say that in the rule book?
It does. Let me.
Are you sure about that?
Oh, I am quite sure.
Where?
I'm gonna pull up the rule book. Sorry.
Here, I'll give you a link to it if you want.
Yeah, please. Let's do
Oh,
it.
whoops, that's not the right one. Hang on. I'll get you the right.
It's a misconception, but it is in fact across the board the case.
Yeah, because the only time I see the word negative is in the multiple answer section in the entire document.
It's not phrased as negative. Do you have the file, or should I just look it up?
You may have to look it up.
Okay.
In the meantime, should we take Ethan's question? While
Yeah,
you
yeah,
guys
yeah.
look up documents. Go ahead, Ethan.
Sorry, I missed this part. Where do we write our questions for any internationals or anything? I missed that.
That's a good question. So for right now, what we're asking folks to do, even if you've written before, is to fill out the Google form and choose the question choose the categories you're comfortable with, or do them all. And then from there, we will sort of reach out and ask for your contributions and have a lot more information and resources to help you with that process.
Okay, sorry. Thank you.
That's fine. You
makes
don't need to apologize.
Right, I'm gonna find it. Well, so invalid questions. Man, where is it? Oh, the full one. I think I'm on the minimalist render. Let's grab the full one.
I pasted a link for the full.
Cool. Okay. All right. Invalid questions. This is not under multiple answers. Example, to help illustrate more the idea of if the question is not answered, consider a scenario where the question asks what is good and the answer states what is not good. In this case, the question is not answered and is tricky or misleading.
Okay, fair enough.
Yep. Yeah, it's yeah. I mean, we refer to them as negative answers, but that's kind of an inside baseball term. That's not a rulebook term, or at least it isn't in that section. I think it might be in the MAs.
It is in the MA.
It's the MAs where it's typically a problem, because you want to write a question like, he is what? Not good, but bad, you know, and then, but you can't do that because.
Right. Well, and I mean, yeah, there are multiple tickets about eliminating this rule as well.
There are some people who really like it. I don't. There might be some fierce debate about it. I am not a fan. It creates problems, I think, more than it solves, but it is what it is. For
I
now,
like
you
I
gotta
like the
follow the rule.
motivation. I like the motivation behind the rule existing. I think it causes I think it causes more problems than it solves. But I like the motivation behind it. But yeah, one of these days we'll actually have a rule book committee that addresses the tickets.
Well, that's the other element of this that's worth pointing out. I haven't heard yet from Zach about the applications, but we did have a rules committee application process that got sent out. I think the email might have somehow not gotten out to all the district coordinators, so we might extend the application deadline. Zach, I think, is out of town, so we'll hear from him and get the ball rolling on that. But just like Heather and I are setting up this ongoing quizzing academy, we're hoping to have an ongoing rulebook committee. So instead of it being ad hoc, hey, let's edit the rulebook, it's been 5 years, the committee will meet every year to make, or at least every year, to make rulebook adjustments and listen to feedback and listen to the comments made on the GitHub that Griffin and Scott and Zach put together. So this is kind of the future of quizzing, is we're trying to keep things ongoing rather than visited to patch up with a Band-Aid. So, well, if there's no further questions, we'll go ahead and
Ethan has his hand up again.
Oh, Ethan, yes.
No, I forgot to turn it off. Sorry.
Oh,
Okay.
no worries.
Well, with that being said, I will stop the recording.